We've got some terrific guests. We have a wonderful program in store. Not only will we be hearing from three special guests who have interesting and distinct contributions to make to the public discourse, but we have a musical item as well. I think I'm going to ask you, the introvert now, to introduce our first guest. Go on, off you go.
Introduce our first guest. Thank you. Now, our first guest, I've actually known for a number of years, Professor Fethi Mansouri. He holds the UNESCO Chair in Comparative Research on Cultural Diversity and Social Justice since 2013. He is also founding director of the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin University here in Melbourne. Among the many questions we have for Professor tonight, we are keen to hear about the impact the COVID-19 pandemic is having on society and culture, as well as identity to some degree, as these are areas which he has extensively researched on. So I would like to welcome Professor Fethi Mansouri.
Thank you very much. Welcome to the threesome. The Ramadan Conversations hour is underway, and already Zuleyha has pumped you up, has given you the best possible start. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to handball to Zuleyha and ask her to start the conversation with a question to you.
Yes. Okay, my first question, Professor Mansouri. Now, with this COVID situation that's on all of our minds, we are seeing significant changes to our society. Now, with this in mind, what kind of a new world order might emerge post-COVID-19? What will and should be its core values and guiding principles?
We are certainly starting with a big question here. Thank you very much, Zuleyha and George, for having me. It's always a pleasure to be part of these conversations that we very much need in a time of both isolation, but also of deep reflection on where we are and where we're heading, I think. Well, COVID-19 is one of those things. I think it will be long discussed and long written about in terms of the significant impacts that it will have on our societies, not just in Australia, but globally speaking. There are many ways of looking at COVID-19. One of them, of course, is we're looking at the public health dimension of it, which is a significant challenge, a challenge that has implications for economies, the likes of which we have not seen really, I think, since the Great Depression. Many people argue that this is probably the single most significant event since World War II, and I think it will be very hard to argue with that. Before I talk about what kind of a world we envisage might emerge post-COVID-19, I want to discuss briefly with you, and you feel free to interrupt and ask questions if you want, talk about the impact of COVID-19 so far on our societies, because it's not just about social distancing. It's not just about trying to find the vaccines which will stop the spread of this virus. And it's certainly not just about us working remotely or engaging in remote schooling or homeschooling. I think it's much more than that. And in many ways, we talked about the hyper-connected nature of our global world. We've been talking about the interdependent nature of our connected world. And what COVID-19 really did is it's brought all of that to a sudden halt, without much of a warning, so to speak. And immediately, we basically decreased, in some cases, ceased altogether, all forms of international mobility, border crossings, border closures in many ways. We engaged in a new way of relating to one another, even within local communities. So all of a sudden, we had to readjust the way we think we can go on about our daily lives, both in relation to the immediate environments within which we live, but also in terms of how we work, in terms of how we engage locally, nationally, and transnationally. And I think all of that will, in my view, have significant impact in the future. One of the really interesting mottos I've seen coming out of Italy is that things will definitely will not go back to normal post-COVID-19, because it's that normal situation that led us to where we are right now, and we should not go back to that normal situation. So you can get the the gist of the fact that there will have to be some fundamental change to the way we do things, to the way we operate globally, to the way we relate to one another as communities, as societies, and as countries. So the implications will be at many levels. Thinking about obviously the political situation, there are discussions about the fact that COVID-19 perhaps has given rise to new forms of governance, which many of us do not feel very comfortable with, and which really impinge on a lot of notions of civil liberties, which perhaps undermine democratic deliberations. And if you think about the way we centralize decision making, not just in Australia, but everywhere, decisions making have been centralized so much that people are governing by decrees. Now that goes against the very essence of democracy. You look at,
but they are national. They are national. They are unity governments, though, or cabinets, aren't they? They're not. It's not one person unilaterally deciding on a course of action. We have in Australia, for example, a number of premiers from territories and states coming together with the Prime Minister of Australia and together working to create a strategy that makes sure that each jurisdiction is looked after as well as the whole.
Sure. Australia is slightly different always because of the federal nature of our governance system. So you have the states which are fiercely independent. They want to look after particular policies, including education, for instance. Whereas in other jurisdictions,
which is taking a fearful hit.
Exactly. In other jurisdictions, it's the case that the supreme leader, so to speak, centralizes all forms of decision making. I know in more than one country where either the prime minister or the president has sought special permission from the parliament to govern by decree, because they do not want to go back to parliament to get certain laws passed or certain legislation passed. They want to be able to govern. I'm not saying that's necessarily bad in the context of COVID-19. What I'm saying is that in itself represents something that we need to be very aware of and very critical of if it leads to a certain precedent in terms of governance. There are also the issues of how we are dealing with the most vulnerable amongst us. And I think this is perhaps where COVID-19 has really exposed and amplified a lot of injustices in our societies, not just local societies or national societies like Australia, but global situation in general has been exposed to.
Is there
being
a particular
really
group that's
so
been particularly affected?
So we'll take, for example, the fact that 1.7 billion children globally needing to be schooled from home, taught from home. When we all talk about our own experiences here, and we are in a very, very privileged situation because we have the infrastructure, we have the means, we have the state which is able to put resources towards this, and we are still finding it very challenging. Now, almost 700 million of children, in particular in the global south, in particular in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, who do not have access neither to infrastructure, nor to the resources, nor to the state capacity to actually deliver these courses. And that means that we are witnessing emerge in front of our own very eyes the manifestation of what is being called by UNESCO global digital disparities. That is, some people can do it and they can move online and continue to function, continue to educate, continue to deliver services, and others are not able to do that. And this really is a situation that should not be happening in 2020, where we talk about sustainable developmental goals and we talk about equitable economic programs across the world. So these are some of the problems that COVID-19 have really exposed quite dramatically, and I think will be one of the things that we need to look at very seriously in a post-COVID-19 world.
Professor, globalization leading right up to the COVID-19 pandemic, as you addressed so rightly, no one saw this coming. What sort of message does this put or send to the world and the leaders who have thought that globalization was the answer for everything?
It's interesting. I mean, it's it kind of goes both ways. In a way, because the outbreak of this virus took place in Wuhan, central China, a very industrial city, which I know very well. I visited many times. And then from Wuhan, for the virus to then find its way to Europe and Northern America and everywhere in the world, shows you that we are really now living in a very much hyper-connected world. So globalization has well and truly shaped the way we operate, the way we are, with the way we live, and the way we are connected to one another in ways that are perhaps not non-reversible. But by the same token, the very fact that this virus has spread so easily across borders globally raised questions about the nature of globalization and the nature of human mobility in particular. There were some interesting articles that have been written recently that, as a matter of fact, if you want to think who spread this virus, it's those cosmopolitan Europeans who travel to China, and then from China they hop on the plane and go back to London and Italy, and so in a way it's not your kind of working class, low socioeconomic people who are responsible. It's those people who've benefited from globalization, in particular, who ended up carrying the virus. But on a serious note, of course, I think there are already serious discussions taking place in terms of what kind of, for instance, global supply chain we want when it comes to health products. What kind of complementarities we seek when it comes to developing resources and capacity to deal with either pandemics or natural disasters or economic crises. We've seen so many of these in the last few years. There are also discussions about the nature of transnational governance. The World Health Organization, as we all know, has come under severe criticism from a number of countries, and people are asking questions: what kind of jurisdiction, what kind of powers, what kind of resources are we giving to some of these transnational organizations, intergovernmental agencies within the UN system, so that they are able to do the job that we want them to do? And in this particular case, it's a job of looking after the global health situation. So no doubt there will be many discussions to be had in relation to what we want to envisage a post-COVID-19 world to look like. It's not a knee-jerk reaction, nor should it be a knee-jerk reaction. We need to take our time to think deeply about this. You do not undo what we've done for the last 60 or 70 years in the space of weeks simply because of COVID-19, but you do take this opportunity, and we should all take this opportunity to actually reflect on what needs to be done from here on, moving on in a post-COVID-19 world, so that this kind of crisis, even if it happens again in the future, we know it will happen. It will not be perhaps COVID-19, it will be another disaster, another pandemic, another crisis. Then we are perhaps better placed to weather the storm than we have done in 2020, and perhaps than we've done previously. So there are many discussions that will be taking place, a lot of reimagining the organization of our world. Dare I say the word reforms might be talked about and might be discussed, so that we learn from COVID-19, and we learn that there are many things that cannot go on as business as usual.
I can imagine the reimagining in an airliner when we finally lift the restrictions and consider travelling again. I don't think we'll be travelling the way we used to in a crowded aircraft filled to the brim.
It will be different.
Well, they'll be more expensive for a start.
Yeah, and just, absolutely, George. And just think about the fact that, for instance, many of us, and me included, I used to religiously work from the office. I go to Deakin every single day, and I love working from my office. Mm. Now I've discovered that I can actually work from home. Do I want to go back and work every single day from my office at Deakin? I don't know. So things like that will change, and I'm sure will change, and it will change for the better in many ways. We are learning to spend time together. We are learning that it's not necessarily the case that everyone has to get into his car or get on a plane or get on a bus or a train and travel for a meeting. Now everyone is meeting online using the technology that is available to us. And so it should, in my view, there should be a lot more of this practice that stays with us after COVID-19 is well and truly finished, because it's good for the environment, it's good for our mental and well-being and health being too, and I think it's good that we are able to balance certain practices in our life so that the ultimate impact on all of us will be minimized in terms of whether it's carbon emissions, whether it's time spent with your loved ones, whether it's balancing life and work, whether it's spending time with kids while they're doing their schoolings, and not expect the public institutions to do all of that for you. And I think perhaps COVID-19 will allow us time to think that we could actually readjust the way we live our lives a little bit, so that we manage to really achieve the meaning of the word sustainable. We talk about sustainability a lot, but we don't really know how we can achieve sustainability from a personal point of view. We expect whether the state, the government, the international agencies to do it for us. I think all of us has a responsibility to contribute to that.
We need a better bandwidth, I think. That will help.
That's yes, absolutely.
Professor,
I think
before we get you to reminisce about Ramadans in the past, especially in your early days in Tunisia when you were growing up, I want to ask you a question about education. You're right in the middle of it, in one of the best campuses in Australia. There are enormous challenges now for all these international students. What messages are we sending to them this COVID-19 pandemic season?
I agree with you, George. It's one of the best campuses, definitely in Australia. It's I'm very happy that you asked that question about education. I think there are many angles that we can bring about in talking about international education and students. International students have really contributed enormously to Australia, both society, culture, campuses in general. And I do not want to talk about the dollars they bring in, because they contribute to the economy significantly. But let's not talk about
absolutely.
that.
The third biggest industry.
And the first export industry in Victoria. But more than that, they bring a vibrancy. They enrich our lives. They contribute through their creativity, through their hard work, through their contribution to the fabric of our societies, locally, nationally, and internationally. And yes, we've seen that that's going to be now hit quite badly for the next, who knows, 3-5 years. Some people are saying we'll never go back to 2019 levels in terms of international students coming to Australia. I hope we are wrong, and we see more of them coming to Australia and going elsewhere to study. And but I think what COVID-19 did is, in a way, it showed that we do not know how to look after people who are not citizens, like people who don't have the citizenship that many of us enjoy here. So be it international students or asylum seekers or temporary workers or all sorts of non-citizens, we do not know how to extend a notion of care towards them. And international students have been
with much to think about. You've left us with much to think about, especially during this holy month of Ramadan. And on the subject of Ramadan, Zuleyha has a question. She wants to take you way back to those early years in Tunis and in Tunisia.
Yeah. Well, we've looked forward a lot and what COVID's going to, how it's going to change. But before COVID times, in your childhood, what kind of a Ramadan did you have in Tunisia?
Ramadan used to be, now that you ask me that question, Ramadan used to be one of the best moments, the best month in the whole year in Tunisia. It's funny enough, it used to be always in summer. I'm not sure. I only remember Ramadan in summer in Tunisia there. So it's and as you know, summer, Mediterranean summer, it's a long day, but then it's a long night too. It has a special charm. It's we say we could smell Ramadan in Tunisia. You don't just hear Ramadan, you smell Ramadan in the streets. Wherever you walk, you can see special shops that are opening and delivering particular goods. They're making special sweets. There are special dishes with people only cook in Ramadan in Tunisia. Families gather like no other time. No other time you find large tables where people gather to break fast. Then the mosques are filled with people who go and do the prayers after breaking fast. Then from there, after the people pray in the mosques, and you find the streets of every single city and town in Tunisia buzzing with life. People do not go home till 3 a.m., George, till 4 a.m. sometimes. And So that connection, that connectivity, that solidarity, that kind of human interaction,
therapy.
that it's very therapeutical, absolutely, and it really enriches the soul. It feeds you, of course, in terms of your what you want to do and who you catch up with. But it's a month like no other in Tunisia, Ramadan, and we always look forward to Ramadan as kids because we know that there's so much fun to have, and there's so many people to catch up with. And of course, when Ramadan finishes, as we all know, the Eid then gets even more fun because you are showered with gifts and you bought new clothes and you're giving money, yes, and so it's all happy memories, George, and we try to recreate that here, of course, but it's not the same. We do our best to recreate that kind of, the gathering and friends. And unfortunately, in COVID-19, we do not exchange visits with friends. We do the iftar dinners, which the AIS plays a significant role in and have been pioneers in doing it. We're trying to make sure that we share Ramadan with everyone else because it's such a beautiful month.
You've certainly shared some wonderful memories with us. On behalf of Zuleyha and myself, we want to thank you and wish you Ramadan Mubarak for this season. And more importantly, we want to take the opportunity to thank you, Professor Fethi Mansouri, for being our opening guest on Ramadan Conversations this year.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, both George and Zuleyha, and look forward to watching the whole thing. Thank you very much.